Hello everyone, welcome back to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. Today is Lecture 2, and we're going to be talking about the Renaissance, or as some people pronounce it, the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth, but as we're going to see, it's actually more of a reawakening, I think. I think that's a better idea than thinking of something being reborn. So remember how last lecture I said think about feudalism? We're going to go back there for a moment. So let's look back on that last lecture about feudalism in the Middle Ages. So feudalism was the social system of the Middle Ages, developed after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. There was no strong central power like the Romans had been. So what you see are these like little smaller kings and chiefs and their supporters around them begin to coalesce and grow more powerful until gradually they gain more and more power of different regions. And the basis of the power would become land. Remember last time we talked about how the king's on top theoretically owns the land? Well, how is the king on top, first off? The kings over time developed the sense that why are they king? Because God chose them to be king. So this idea of divine right to rule really begins to develop in the Middle Ages, especially as they are more and more tied with the Pope in Rome and recognized as the ruler by the Pope in Rome. So in the Middle Ages we start to see this idea of divine right to be king. So it made sense that then they would own all the land. And then you'll remember that they leased some of this land back to the nobles, who then give some of that land to the knights, who then have peasants and freeholders, as well as serfs below them working the land for them. And so those peasants, those freeholders, those serfs give food and services to these knights. The knights offer protection and military service for the nobles, and the nobles use those knights and the military service that they provide, as well as money. They give it back to the king. So if the king needs an army, he has to go through the nobles to get it. And we explained that a little bit closely last time. You can see there, I mentioned serfs this time. Those are the slaves that were tied to the land. So if you sold a piece of land, then the serfs would stick with that, and the new owners would own those serfs. We also see that along with the divine right, the king is the one who makes the laws. And because God put him in power. But by 1400, we start to see problems arising in the feudal system. It begins to break down. So it's thrown out of balance a bit. We see on our left the king, the nobles, the knights, the freeborn peasants and serfs. In the late feudalism, there are new powers that come about. Merchants, this new merchant class, people who buy and sell products, and guilds. Guilds are like early trade unions. They controlled the training, the quality, and the prices of goods. There could be guilds for silversmiths, there could be guilds for woodworkers. So all these different trades had these guilds, these early type of trade unions that controlled those aspects of production and sales. Whereas feudalism, the wealth had always been based on land, right? The more land you have, the more peasants and freeholders and serfs that you have that could get you more resources, making you wealthier. Well, now wealth is becoming more and more based on trade, at least with these merchant class and the guilds. Some of these merchants would become so powerful over time, so wealthy, that they actually began to control the towns that were developing around them. In the Middle Ages, there weren't really cities. There were a few cities, but for the most part, it was more widespread. There were smaller towns, but as we're progressing in the years, these towns are growing larger and larger, especially with the increase of trade. So now these merchants and these guilds, which are located in these growing towns, because they're so wealthy, because they're from there, they have more and more control over these towns. And here's an example of a depiction of Italian merchants in the late Middle Ages. Guilds could become so wealthy that they could actually hire the same architects that the church and that the kings would hire. So what we see, this is the Guildhall actually in London. It was finished in 1440. This was reconstructed after World War II. It was unfortunately destroyed in the bombings, but they reconstructed it to how it looked. And you can see it's very, very similar to church designs, right? It looks almost like a church, in fact. And that's because the same architects who built churches built halls for guilds. Now, the Renaissance is a massive, massive topic. One that could easily take, just an entire semester on its own. And we're going to see basically every lecture that is going to be part of this class could be its own semester course. And that's kind of the trick of this. But this is just an introduction course, so we're just trying to get a sense of what's going on. So the Renaissance is such a large topic, and it's massive. It spreads throughout Europe. So we've got to, for our purposes, shrink it down. We are going to be focused then specifically in Italy, and more specifically in Florence. Here we can see Florence right up here. There's the city of Florence, and this little blue area here is the area that they will control. So it's a city-state that controls that surrounding area. By 1400, there's no united Italy. There won't be a united Italy until we see it later in the semester. Instead, what we have are lots of different governments and lots of different government styles. You have duchies, which are led by a duke, like Savoy up here in the north. There are also kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Naples, Kingdom of Sicily. The Papal States, which are right around here, you can see them in that purple, which are under the Pope in Rome. And then you have republics like Florence and Venice. Although Florence, over time, is going to become less and less a republic as the big families begin to control it, especially one family in particular. And here is a contemporary painting of Florence. This is a painting by Vasari in 1460. This is what Florence looked like in 1460. The real drivers of the Renaissance, those who made it possible, were this new class called the Urban Nobility. We talked about towns and cities growing more powerful, growing larger, and how merchants became richer and richer. Well, land was also still valuable. But nobles really realized really quickly that there were new ways to become wealthy. And that, land was still very important, but there were new ways to get wealth. And so what do? They decide that they are going to join in with this merchant class. They want to gain access to that trade that the merchant class controls, so they start to marry their sons and daughters to the sons and daughters of the merchants. And what we see is this new class developing, the class we call the urban nobility. So they both have the wealth of the land from the old nobles and the wealth from the trade. So these people are going to become very, very rich, very, very powerful. And here on our right, we see one of the patriarchs of the big families in Florence. This is Cosimo de' Medici. And this urban nobility would own then these big country estates, wide land, massive, just massive amounts of land. Then they would also own these buildings in the cities and the towns. These are actually both, were both controlled by the de' Medici family in Florence. And you can see the structures that they kept in the cities were almost look like fortresses. That's because, as other families become more and more wealthy, there start to be rivalries. And so you kind of make these like urban palaces that are almost like fortresses, just to kind of protect yourself. Now, this urban nobility, they did have claims to that old noble land, right? So they have wealth coming in from the land, and they have wealth coming in from trade. But because they're not, they don't have such a grand stature as the old nobles, because they've been kind of mixing with the merchant class, they kind of feel like they have to justify their position in society now, or to really show that they deserve to be ruling these cities and these towns. So they have to show this wealth. And how do you show this new wealth that you have? Well, what they do is they hire scholars, poets, painters, sculptors, architects to create works for them, to just like how people still collect art today. It's a way of spending your money and having something beautiful to show for it, to just show that you can do this. Now, the works of these artists also many times would celebrate the patrons, the members of the urban nobility funding them. So there could be propaganda aspects to it too. And during the Renaissance, the inspiration for the work of these artists comes mainly from the classical past, the past of Rome and Greece. After the fall of Rome, there were still many, many aspects of the Roman world and Greek culture around. It just didn't disappear in the blink of an eye. You still had buildings, roads, bridges, and ruins that, were littered throughout Western Europe. Here we see a Piranesi drawing of the remains of the temple of Jupiter Tonans. That's Jupiter the Thunderer. And you can see these little tiny people here next to these massive remains of this temple. And they're standing on the ground, which is now covering up a lot of the temple. Over the time in Rome, there were floods and floods that kept building up the ground level. And so you would have these buildings just sticking out. And you can still see it if you go to Rome today. Sometimes you'll just see columns sticking out of the ground that are buried under other parts. So there's buildings, ruins, bridges, roads. There's also pieces of art that are being rediscovered. This is the Laocoon and Sons, which was found in Rome in 1506. So they rediscovered it. 1506. Nice piece of marble. They would also find pieces in bronze. This is the bronze chimera found in Arezzo in 1553. And literature was being kind of rediscovered. Latin literature had been preserved in the monasteries. What they would do is the monks would write by hand. They'd copy these ancient texts in Latin and create manuscripts from these ancient texts, thus kind of preserving them. And this is actually a manuscript of Virgil's Aeneid, Book 2 in this case. In 1453, which we'll get to, the old Byzantine Empire, that old Eastern Roman Empire, remember, they're still the Romans, they still consider themselves the Romans, but we call them the Byzantines. 1453, they're going to finally collapse after losing Constantinople. And we'll get there when we talk about the Turks. But after 1453, we see, and well, even before then, as the Turks keep moving forward more and more into Byzantine land, the scholars of the Byzantine world begin to take works with them, ancient Greek literature with them, and bring it to the West, where they're hoping to find some safe haven. So we see Latin literature being rediscovered in monasteries, and we see Greek literature being brought to Western Europe from the falling Byzantine Empire. The spread of these Roman and Greek ideas was greatly aided by the printing press. The printing press with movable type. The European version of it is invented in the 1450s by a German smith named Johannes Gutenberg. Printing made it easier to spread all kinds of knowledge, and in this case, especially that of Rome and Greece. You know, instead of having some poor monk have to copy by hand, you know, each word, what you do is you just set your type, which is it's a consuming process. But once you have the type all set, then you can just put the ink on, press it down into the paper, put some more ink on, press it down onto another piece of paper. So you can make multiple copies of this page, reset your type, go on to the next page, so on and so forth. And with this greater aspect, or greater spread of ideas, how much easier it is, that makes it that much easier for people to be influenced by the Romans and the Greeks. So artists and scholars then, taking this this rediscovered knowledge of the ancient past, began to combine it with their own techniques and their own, you know, ideas and sensibilities and values of their own world. And we see this fusing of something completely new, where influence is coming from the ancient world, but at the same time, there's also great elements and influence coming from their own contemporary world. And we get this new, this whole new movement. So, like I was saying, Renaissance technically means rebirth, but in many ways, they're not like, you know, Victor Frankenstein bringing to life, you know, his creature. Instead, they're much more like Prince Florimond awaking Sleeping Beauty from her slumber. I think that's probably a better metaphor for it. Back to Florence. Again, right here. Italy, the boot. There's Florence there, the city, and the area that they control. So the urban nobility there, especially the De Medici, they were becoming more and more powerful as they were becoming wealthier. The De Medici themselves, they got rich first off from the wool trade. They started to corner the market in wool trade. This is a lovely Romney sheep there. My old professor would be really upset if I didn't mention and didn't show a picture of a nice Romney sheep, his favorite type of sheep. So there it is, a Romney sheep. And then once they got money from the wool trade, they then went into banking, right? So they had this extra money, they would lend it out for interest, and make more money that way. Now, the leading families of Florence, including the de' Medici, they wanted their city to seem like it was a growing power. They wanted to be on equal with Rome and with Paris and other big important cities in Europe. And one of the ways you did that was you had a grand cathedral, something that was inspiring, something that really showed how much wealth the city could put into a building and just make people marvel at it. And so they started to create Il Duomo, the cathedral. Construction began in 1296, but by 1418 it still wasn't finished because nobody could figure out how to build the dome. So this is what it would have looked like without the dome. They have, pretty nice big building, but they don't have that final eye-catching piece of it. So the city leaders decided to hold a competition to see who, if anyone, could finally finish this dome and complete their cathedral. And Filippo Brunelleschi, an artist and architect who was tied to the de' Medici, won. His pitch was chosen, and remember how we were talking about these artists are taking inspiration from the ancient world? Well, in order to finish this dome, he really studied the Pantheon in Rome. So this is the Pantheon in Rome, dedicated during the time of the Emperor Hadrian. So we're looking early to mid 2nd century CE was when this version of the Pantheon was dedicated. So he's inspired by the dome there on the Pantheon. He also read a book on Roman architecture by the architect Vitruvius, and using the description of machines that Vitruvius mentions, he's able to create his own machines to help him build this dome. And he's using his own contemporary technology as well for these machines. So he's mixing Vitruvius's ideas with what they have currently, and he's able to make these machines. In doing so, he was able to finish this dome, and you see just how towering this cathedral is above the city skyline. This is, a contemporary, a modern picture of it. So, just a massive eye-catching dome created with the inspiration of the Pantheon, as well as the literature on how domes and Roman buildings were built by Vitruvius. The de' Medici and other families of this urban nobility also supported many different artists, right? So that was the Il Duomo was a citywide project to bring fame and glory to the city. Individual families, and as well as the city, we'll see, also commissioned artists to create, works for them. Some famous artists that had ties to the de' Medici specifically, Donatello. Here's his bronze statue of David. This is the first male nude statue in Europe since the fall of Rome. And this is roughly around 1440 CE. It did have a little bit of criticism. People said that it was a little homoerotic, that he was a little too feminine. So they're going to try to create new statues of David after this. But Donatello is one of the artists supported by the de' Medici. Also, Botticelli. This is The Birth of Venus, which is obviously a story inspired by the ancient Greek and Roman religion. We see the birth of Venus, a goddess, the goddess of love, in Aphrodite in Greek. And Botticelli paints it. Very, very famous painting. Roughly around 1485 is when he paints this. Botticelli also did more propaganda works for the De Medici. Can you recognize what's going on here? This is the birth of Jesus, right? So, or the visiting of the three kings to Jesus. So this is the adoration of the Magi around 1475, but instead of the three kings or the three wise men, they are replaced by the De Medici family. Here we see, right in the middle, holding the feet of baby Jesus is Cosimo de' Medici himself, and his two sons right down here are the other two Magi. And by this time, Cosimo is dead, but he's the patriarch of the family, so they include him in this. And not only are his sons included, you also get other members of the family. It wasn't just the three wise men who visited Jesus, it was their whole, their cousin Joe came along with them, or whatever. But that's how powerful these families were, and that's how kind of inflated they thought of themselves, right? They are so devoted to Christianity that they are on the same level as the three wise men. But you can imagine the message behind this whenever anyone would see this, right? This is a very important, powerful family that is so close to Jesus, even. So artists could do stuff like that. Vasari, more of an art historian, but he also painted himself, was a bit of an architect too, so mainly known as an art historian, but we saw earlier that depiction of Florence in 1460, that was by Vasari. This is his painting of St. Jerome. And he also painted members of the De Medici family. This is Alessandro de' Medici. So he would also do more propaganda-esque works for the family, including portraits. He's also known for designing the tomb for perhaps the most famous artist, maybe ever. He designed the tomb of Michelangelo. So Michelangelo, also tied to the De Medici family. This is his David statue, so the same biblical figure that Donatello had created in bronze. The whole city of Florence commissioned Michelangelo to create this statue of David out of one massive piece of marble that was so heavy that they had to, it was very difficult for them to move it around, and in fact, sometimes it was almost next to impossible to move it. So, the David is commissioned by Michelangelo by the heads of Florence from 1501 to 1504. He spent creating this. Michelangelo also created this in marble, the Pietà. This was for a French cardinal, 1498 to 1499, currently in the Vatican. It's in St. Peter's. And of course, he also would then go on to work for the Pope, painted the Sistine Chapel, which is here. The very, very famous painting on the roof. Oh, there. Equally as famous, Leonardo da Vinci also spent a short time associated with the De Medici. In fact, he lived with them for a few years. And the only reason why he left was the De Medicis requested him to go to Milan to help create peace between Florence and Milan. This is Leonardo da Vinci's unfinished work. It's of St. Jerome, and this was roughly 1480, which was when he was actually living with the De Medici. He just never finished it because he went off to Milan at their request. And of course, Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. And the woman that is Mona Lisa, she was the wife of a wealthy silk merchant of Florence. So this is another wealthy family, part of that urban nobility in Florence, you know, contracting an artist to create something lovely for themselves to show their wealth. So this is 1503 to 1506 that he painted this. And then there's also the Vitruvian Man. I wanted to add this because it's named the Vitruvian Man after Vitruvius, that Roman architect that we talked about with Brunelleschi, inspiring Brunelleschi. Well, he's very big on proportions, and thus why his name is associated with the Vitruvian Man, which was created in 1490. The de' Medici became so powerful, so influential, that members of their family, 3 different members of their family, actually became popes. We have Leo X, Clement VII, and Leo XI. We're all members of the de' Medici family who became popes. This is a painting of Leo X, and actually Clement VII is in this painting as well. He's right back here. That's Clement VII before he's Clement VII. He's just a regular cardinal at this time. We have Pope Leo X. We have soon-to-be Pope Clement VII. And this work was by the painter Raphael. So now we have all of our Ninja Turtles, finally. Right? We've got Donatello, Leonardo, there's Raphael now, and Michelangelo. Hooray, we have our crime-fighting heroes in a half-shell. Not only did the de' Medici family come to control Florence and even become pope at times, they had two of their daughters would become Queen of France. First one, Catherine de' Medici, and the second one, Marie de' Medici. And this is actually Marie de' Medici. Her name in Italy would have been Maria, but we're going to go, since she's the Queen of France, we're going to call her Marie. So there's a young Marie de' Medici in Florence. In October of 1600, Marie married Henri IV, the King of France and Navarre. This here is a painting by Peter Paul Rubens. He's a Flemish painter, which is up in Belgium and the Netherlands, around that area. And we see this idealized version of Henri first seeing Marie there. You know, he sees her portrait and he's just struck by it, as the Roman god Jupiter and his wife Juno watch on the happily married couple. Well, kind of happily. Juno was associated with marriage, and she protected and watched over marriages. So there they are watching over this Henri's first encounter, or first time seeing Marie, and he's just so struck by her, is the idea. And you can see France right there saying that she'd make a great queen. And so they do get married in 1600, October of 1600, in a big lavish ceremony. 4,000 guests are there. And, like I said, this painting, we see the classical influences there. The entertainment at the wedding also had classical influence, because the entertainment included the second opera ever written. This is L'Euridice by Jacopo Peri. Jacopo Peri had written an opera just a year or two earlier. He writes this second one for this wedding, and it's performed there. the Lauridice is about the ancient Greek myth of the most beautiful singer in the world, a guy named Orpheus. His voice is just amazing. The problem is that his wife had died unexpectedly. She was bitten by a snake. And so Orpheus decides to go down into the underworld and bring back his wife. And he does that. He goes into the underworld. He meets Persephone, the queen of the underworld, and Hades. And he's able to convince them, through his singing and just through his pleas, that to get his wife back, Eurydice. So his wife is Eurydice. That's where the title comes from. And they agree that he can take Eurydice back. But he's got to climb all the way back through the underworld, which is quite the trek. And they give him one command. Yes, you can lead your wife there, but you can only look forward as you go. So he's leading Eurydice out of the underworld. She's just a shade at this time, at this point. She's dead. She's just a shade, like a ghost. And he's leading, going on, and he's really, really close to the end. But for a moment, he just has this fear that maybe she's not there behind him. And so what does he do? He turns around and looks behind, and he sees the shade of his wife fly backwards back into the underworld. And he's not allowed to take her back then. He was so close, but he just got so scared, so worried that he turned around, and like that, he lost her. So we see this opera, what will be opera. This is inspired. The story itself is an ancient Greek story. Then, on top of that, Perry invented opera he included it where the singing was how the verses were everybody sung what was going on. And the reason why he did that was because that's how he thought Greek plays were. That's how he thought they were performed. Greek tragedies and comedies, they were spoken in rhythm. So they weren't really sung, but they had certain rhythms to them, a meter to them. And so he, heard that they had this meter, and he thought that must mean that they're sung. But that's not really the case. It's more of a, just spoken to a rhythm. But he didn't know that, so he had them sing what was going on. So again, we see this ancient Greek topic, this idea of how ancient Greek plays were performed, inspiring this composer to make something entirely new. And that's really the main point that I want us to think about when we talk about the Renaissance. The Renaissance was this mixture of the ancient world and the contemporary world of the artists, the world of which they lived in. And it was this combination together that created something brand new. And so this is all being, driven by the urban nobility, by who are driven by trade, right? They make their money off of trade. So in the next lecture, what we're going to see is how trade is going to change Europe in other ways. How trade is going to be the major driving force of the age of exploration, which is going on right at the same time that these artists are working on their pieces, creating all this amazing work. So next time, we'll look at the age of exploration. This is Greg, signing off.